The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the bedroom door like something shameful that didn't deserve to be handed over face to face. Clara Bennett found them when she stepped out of the bathroom, her hair still damp, a white towel wrapped around her shoulders. She stood there for a long moment staring at the manila envelope on the hardwood floor, and something deep in her chest told her she already knew what was inside, had known perhaps for months. She picked it up anyway. The penthouse smelled of fresh coffee and cut flowers, the way it always did. 70 floors above Manhattan, the apartment occupied an entire floor of the Hargrove Tower, a building that bore the name of the man she had married 3 years ago. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered under a pale October sky, boats carving slow white lines across the Hudson River below. It was the kind of view that made ordinary people feel powerful. Clara had stopped noticing it a long time ago. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of coffee before she opened it. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Nathaniel James Hargrove. Respondent, Clara Ann Bennett Hargrove. Nathaniel. She turned the name over in her mind the way a person turns over a stone found on a beach, familiar in shape, strange when examined too closely. 3 years of marriage, and he still felt like someone she was perpetually on the verge of understanding. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were unhurried on the polished floor, the confident stride of a man who had never once second-guessed his direction. Nathaniel Hargrove appeared in the kitchen doorway at exactly 7:15, dressed in a charcoal suit that had been tailored to the precise geometry of his body. He was 36 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and unreasonably handsome in the way that certain men are, the kind of handsome that functions less like a gift and more like a warning. A silver watch caught the morning light on his left wrist. He looked at the papers in her hand and said nothing for a moment. "You found them," he said finally. "They were on the floor," Clara replied. Her voice was calm. She was proud of that too. He walked to the espresso machine and pressed a button with the practiced ease of a man performing a ritual. "I was going to sit down with you this evening. Explain everything. You could explain it now." He turned to face her, and she noticed, not for the first time, that his eyes were very dark, the color of deep water. They gave nothing away. They never had. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him at that hospital charity gala in Boston 3.5 years ago, and it was the thing she had most consistently misread. She had mistaken his reserve for depth. She had confused his silence for meaning. "Vivienne is back," he said. 3 words. Clara set her coffee cup down carefully on the granite counter. Vivienne Cole. Clara had heard the name exactly once before, spoken by Nathaniel's younger sister, Rachel, at a family dinner 18 months ago. Rachel had let it slip with the careless precision of someone dropping something deliberately. Vivienne was the one he never really got over, and then immediately looked horrified at herself, changing the subject to the renovation of their mother's house in Connecticut. Clara had filed the name away in a quiet corner of her mind and never retrieved it. Until now. "She came back from London," Nathaniel continued. He was watching Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that sat between guilt and resolve. "She's been in London for 4 years, and she—" He paused. "She wants to try again. And I know, that I owe it to myself to find out if there's something still there." Clara looked at him for a long time. Outside the windows, a helicopter tracked slowly across the skyline, and the city continued its indifferent roar 40 stories below. "You're asking me to sign those papers," she said. "I'm asking you to be reasonable about this." Reasonable. The word landed with a particular kind of weight. Clara had been reasonable for 3 years. She had been reasonable when his work swallowed entire weeks, and he returned home smelling of boardrooms and exhaustion. She had been reasonable when events she had planned together were cancelled because a deal required his presence in Dubai, in Singapore, in Sao Paulo. She had been reasonable about his moods, his silences, his habit of being physically present and emotionally unreachable. She had bent herself into the shape of a woman who asked for very little, and she had done it so thoroughly that she was no longer certain what the original shape had been. "I'll need to speak with my attorney," she said. "Of course." He seemed almost relieved. "Take whatever time you need. The terms are generous, Clara. You'll see that. The apartment in the West Village is yours. The settlement is more than fair. I've made sure of that." She nodded once slowly and picked up her coffee again. She took a sip. It had gone cold. Nathaniel left for the office at 7:45, carrying his briefcase and his certainty, and Clara stood at the window for a long time after she heard the elevator doors close. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass and looked out at the city that bore his name on half its skyline. Hotels, a convention center, 2 residential towers still under construction on the west side. The Hargrove Empire. 3 years she had lived inside it like a bird in a very beautiful cage. And now the door had been opened, and she was expected to simply fly away. She thought about calling Rachel. She thought about calling her mother in Vermont. She did neither. Instead, she went to the small room off the master suite that Nathaniel had allocated for her use. She had never quite managed to think of it as her office, the way he thought of his study as his. And she sat down at the desk and opened her laptop. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. Nathaniel had simply been the kind of husband who consistently forgot that. Clara Bennett, before she was Clara Hargrove, had spent 5 years as a financial consultant at a mid-sized firm in Boston. It was where she had met Nathaniel. He had been a client briefly before his wealth outgrew the firm's capacity. She had been good at her work, precise, perceptive, unafraid of difficult numbers. When they married, she had stepped back from the firm at his quiet and persistent suggestion and had spent the following years on various charitable boards, managing the Hargrove Foundation's grant portfolio, attending dinners. She had been good at that too. She had been good at everything required of her. The problem was that none of it had ever quite felt like hers. She opened a document she had been working on for 7 weeks. A business plan. Detailed. Meticulous. The product of early mornings and late nights while Nathaniel slept or traveled. She had told no one about it. Not Rachel. Not her mother. Certainly not her husband. Clara read through it carefully, made 3 small corrections, and then sat back in her chair and looked at the October sky beyond the window. The helicopter was gone. The river moved. The city continued. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized. "Margaret," she said when the line connected. "It's Clara. I need to meet with you today. Something has changed." A pause. "Actually, everything has changed, but I think that might be exactly what I needed." She hung up the phone, looked once more at the divorce papers on the counter across the room and felt, beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, beneath the cold weight of being discarded, something else entirely. Something that felt, cautiously and almost against her will, like the first breath of open air. She had no idea yet how much Nathaniel Hargrove did not know about the woman he was so casually letting go. Margaret Holloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue that smelled of old carpet and ambition. She was 62 years old, sharp-eyed, and had been practicing corporate law for 35 years, with the quiet ferocity of someone who had spent decades being underestimated. Clara had found her 2 years ago, not through Nathaniel's circle of polished attorneys, but through her own research, a name that kept appearing in cases involving women navigating complex financial separations from powerful men. She had made an appointment on a Tuesday afternoon, told Nathaniel she was having lunch with a friend from the foundation board, and had spent 90 minutes in this same office laying out the architecture of her marriage with the careful precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this possibility without ever admitting it to herself. "He served you without warning," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. She was reading through the settlement document, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her expression professionally neutral. "He slipped the envelope under the bedroom door," Clara said. Margaret looked up briefly. "Charming." She returned to the document. "The West Village apartment is valued at approximately $3.2 million. The cash settlement he's proposing is $4 million. He's also offering to maintain your position as director of the Hargrove Foundation for 12 months post-divorce, with full compensation." "He wants it to look clean," Clara said. "It is clean," Margaret replied. "Strategically. He's offering enough that most women in your position would sign within the week and call it generous. She set the document down and looked at Clara over her glasses. But you're not going to do that. No, Clara said. I'm not. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Tell me about the foundation work. For the next hour, Clara talked. She laid out 3 years of work, not the ceremonial work, the ribbon cutting and the gala attendance, but the actual operational work she had quietly absorbed and expanded. When she had taken over the Hargrove Foundation's grant portfolio, it had been distributing approximately $8 million annually to a loosely managed collection of charitable causes, many of them chosen for their social visibility rather than their impact. Within 18 months, Clara had restructured the entire operation. She had implemented a rigorous evaluation framework, renegotiated administrative contracts, redirected funding toward organizations with measurable outcomes, and increased the foundation's annual distribution to $14 million without increasing its operating budget. She had done all of this while attending the dinners and the galas and the weekends in the Hamptons, and she had done it without ever once asking Nathaniel for credit. She had also, quietly and separately, been building something else. The plan I showed you 2 months ago, Clara said. I've completed the financial modeling. Margaret nodded. She had seen the early draft. Walk me through the numbers. Clara opened her bag and produced a printed document, 42 pages, bound, with a cover sheet that read, Holloway Capital Advisory, Project Bennett, Phase 1. She slid it across the desk. The plan was for an independent financial advisory firm, boutique in size, focused on mid-market women-owned businesses seeking growth capital. Clara had identified a gap in the market that she understood intimately, because she had lived inside the machinery of wealth long enough to see exactly where it failed ordinary people. Women with viable, growing businesses who couldn't access the right rooms, couldn't speak the right language, couldn't find advisors who understood both the financial mechanics and the specific pressures they faced. Clara spoke all of those languages fluently. She had spent 3 years learning them at close range. Seed capital required? Margaret asked, flipping through the document. $800,000 to launch properly. Office space? 2 junior hires? 18 months of operating runway. Clara paused. The settlement Nathaniel is offering covers it, with room to spare. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something that might have been admiration. You've been planning this. I've been preparing, Clara said carefully. There's a difference. There was. Clara had not planned for the divorce. She had not anticipated Vivian Cole's return from London or Nathaniel's sudden retrieval of a love she hadn't known was still stored somewhere inside him. But she had, slowly, honestly, come to understand over the past year that her marriage was a structure she was maintaining alone, and that the life she was living was a very good approximation of someone else's idea of what her life should be. The business plan had begun as a mental exercise on a sleepless night in February and had grown, page by page, into something real and serious and entirely her own. What she hadn't expected was how steady she would feel when the moment finally arrived. Margaret picked up her pen. I'm going to request full documentation of your contributions to the Foundation's financial restructuring. We're going to establish the quantifiable value of what you built there. And then we're going to have a very different conversation with Nathaniel's attorneys about what an equitable settlement actually looks like. Clara nodded. There's something else, she said. She reached back into her bag and produced a second document, a single sheet, printed from an email she had received 4 days ago. She had not told Margaret about this yet. She had not told anyone. 3 weeks before the divorce papers appeared under the bedroom door, Clara had been contacted by a woman named Diane Fowler, the executive director of a non-profit investment group called the Alderton Women's Fund. The fund identified and supported women building businesses in financial services, a niche, mission-driven pool of capital that had been operating quietly for 6 years. Diane had read a profile of the Hargrove Foundation published in a philanthropy journal, noted Clara's name as the architect of its restructuring, and had done her own research from there. The email was an invitation to discuss a potential partnership, The Alderton Fund was prepared to consider a seed investment in the right venture. They had been looking for the right founder for 2 years. Clara placed the printout on Margaret's desk. "I haven't responded yet. I wanted to speak with you first." Margaret read the email twice. When she looked up, her expression had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. "Do you know what the Alderton Fund's typical investment size is?" "Between 500,000 and 1.5 million, Clara said, "depending on the proposal." "And you have a 42-page proposal sitting on my desk right now." "I do." Margaret set the paper down and was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the midday traffic on Lexington Avenue produced its constant low thunder. A taxi horn, a fragment of someone's radio, the city going about its ordinary, relentless business. "Clara," Margaret said slowly, "does Nathaniel know any of this?" Clara thought about her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, standing in the kitchen that morning with his espresso and his certainty and his 3 carefully chosen words. "Vivian is back." She thought about the way he had looked at her, not unkindly, but with the particular blindness of a man who had decided what he was seeing long before he opened his eyes. "Nathaniel," she said. "She has never once asked me what I'm working on." Margaret allowed herself a small, precise smile. "Then I think we should keep it that way for now." On her way back uptown, Clara sat in the back of a cab and watched the city move past the window. She thought about Vivian Cole, this woman who had lived 4 years in London and returned like a tide coming back in, pulling Nathaniel with her. She felt something about that. Grief, yes, and the particular sting of being replaced. But she found, examining the feeling carefully, that it was not the dominant emotion. What sat at the center of her chest, quiet and surprisingly solid, was something she identified only gradually, turning it over in the motion of the cab. It was relief, and beneath the relief, almost too fragile yet to name, the first faint outline of something that felt like excitement. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it, and for the first time that day, something surprised her. "Ms. Bennett, this is Diane Fowler from the Alderton Fund. I hope you don't mind the direct message. I was wondering if you might be free for coffee this week. I think we have a great deal to discuss." Clara read the message twice, then she typed back, "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. You choose the place." She pressed send and looked back out the window at the city, and she thought, Nathaniel Hargrove was about to discover that the woman he had handed his divorce papers to was not the woman he believed he had married. He just didn't know it yet. Diane Fowler was not what Clara had expected. She had imagined someone corporate, polished, the kind of woman who wore power the way certain people wear expensive perfume, as announcement. Instead, the woman who stood up from a corner table at a small cafe on West 44th Street was 50-something, with reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair, a coffee already half-finished in front of her, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent years learning that urgency was usually a performance. "Clara Bennett," she said, extending her hand, "I feel like I already know you from that philanthropy journal piece. Though I suspect what you built at the Hargrove Foundation was considerably more interesting than what they wrote about." Clara sat down. "It was." Diane smiled. "Good. I prefer honesty to modesty. We can get further faster." She signaled to the server, then leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at Clara with the direct attention of someone who did not believe in warming up slowly. "Tell me what you want to build. Not what you think I want to hear. What you actually want." It was such a simple question. Clara had been asked many questions over the course of her marriage. What she wanted for dinner, what she thought of a particular property Nathaniel was considering acquiring, whether she preferred the Maldives or Sardinia for the summer. Nobody had asked her this question in a very long time. She felt its directness like a hand pulling her upright. She talked for 40 minutes. She described the gap she had identified, the women she had watched struggle to access capital and guidance that the market offered freely to men with half their qualifications, the specific model she had designed, the financial projections, the 2-year roadmap. She talked about her restructuring of the Hargrove Foundation with specific numbers and named outcomes. She talked about what she was good at and why. Without apology, and without false humility. Diane listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "The Alderton Fund has been looking for this exact profile for 2 years," she said. "Female founder, financial services background, demonstrable track record with institutional money, mission aligned." She paused. "We'd be prepared to discuss an investment of $1.2 million, structured as a convertible note, with a 3-year runway and no board seat. We prefer to back founders, not direct them." Clara kept her expression steady. $1.2 million was at the top of the fund's range. It was also, combined with her settlement from the divorce, enough to build something real. "I'd like to present the full plan to your committee," Clara said. "I'd like you to," Diane replied, 2 weeks from Thursday." They shook hands across the small table, and Clara walked back out into the October morning, feeling as though the city had shifted slightly on its axis. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but perceptibly, the way the ground feels different after rain. She had 3 missed calls from Nathaniel. She called him back from the sidewalk, standing outside the cafe with the noise of the street around her. "Clara." His voice carried the faint compression of a man managing something. "My attorneys tell me you've retained Margaret Holloway." "That's correct." A pause. "She has a reputation for being difficult. She has a reputation for being thorough," Clara said. "I thought that seemed appropriate." Another pause, longer this time. "I want this to be civil," he said. "I want it to be fair." "Then it will be," Clara said. "Margaret is requesting documentation of my contributions to the Foundation's restructuring. I assume your team will cooperate." The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. It was the first crack, small and thin in Nathaniel's certainty. Because the Foundation's restructuring had been real and significant and quantifiable, and his attorneys would know, when they examined the records, that the numbers told a story that his settlement offer had not accounted for. "Of course," he said. She hung up and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the stream of people move past her. A delivery cyclist, a woman with a stroller, a man in a paint-spattered jacket eating a sandwich while he walked. The ordinary, unstoppable motion of the city. She had lived above it for 3 years, looking down. It felt good to be inside it again. What happened next, Clara did not anticipate. She had known in a general way that Vivian Cole existed. She had known the name, the approximate history, the fact of London. What she had not known, what nobody had thought to tell her, including Nathaniel, was that Vivian Cole and Margaret Holloway's paralegal, a young woman named Jessie Park, were cousins. And Jessie, without any malice or strategy, had mentioned to her cousin over the phone that she was working on a case involving Clara Hargrove, and Vivian, who had returned from London 6 weeks ago and was finding her re-entry into New York considerably more complicated than she had imagined, had found herself thinking about that name. Clara discovered all of this on a Wednesday afternoon, when she arrived at Margaret's office for a document review and found a woman already seated in the waiting area. The woman was striking, tall, auburn-haired, with the kind of bone structure that photographers look for, and the slightly worn expression of someone carrying something heavy. She looked up when Clara walked in, and something crossed her face, recognition, though they had never met. "You're Clara," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Clara stopped. "I am. I'm Vivian Cole." The waiting room was very quiet. The receptionist had found something urgent to study on her computer screen. Clara looked at the woman who had returned from London and dismantled her marriage, and she felt the various emotions she might have expected. Anger, curiosity, the hot pull of comparison, and then, cutting through all of them, something she hadn't expected at all. Vivian Cole looked exhausted, not travel-tired or casually worn, genuinely deeply exhausted, the kind that lives behind the eyes. "I don't know why I came here," Vivian said quietly. "I found out by accident that this was your attorney's office. I didn't plan this, I just needed to see you." She looked down at her hands. "I need to tell you something about Nathaniel, something I think you deserve to know, something he hasn't told you." Clara sat down in the chair across from her. "Tell me," she said. What Vivian said next rearranged everything. Nathaniel had not simply reconnected with Vivian when she returned from London. The truth, which Vivian delivered in a quiet and steady voice, was more complicated and more painful than that. Nathaniel had been in contact with Vivian for the past 8 months. Not romantically, not entirely, but consistently. Emails, phone calls, one visit to London in March that he had told Clara was a site visit for a development project on the South Bank. He had been slowly rebuilding something with Vivian while still married to Clara. And he had done it not impulsively, not in a moment of weakness, but deliberately, methodically, in the careful way he did everything. "He told me you two had grown apart," Vivian said, "that you were essentially living separate lives, that the marriage had been over in spirit for more than a year." She looked up at Clara. "I believed him. I had no reason not to." A pause. "And then last week I ran into Rachel at a dinner, and she told me about the foundation work, about what you'd built. She was so proud of you, the way she talked about it." Vivian's jaw tightened. That wasn't someone living a separate life. That was someone fully present, doing serious work, while her husband was quietly making other plans. Clara sat with that for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the office windows at a low angle, stretching across the carpet in pale yellow bars. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Because I came back from London thinking I was the person he'd chosen, and now I'm not sure I want to be chosen by someone who operates like that." Her voice was even, but her hands were not quite still in her lap. "And because I think you deserve to walk into that attorney's office knowing the full picture." Clara stood. She smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, a small, composed gesture. She thought about Nathaniel in the kitchen 2 weeks ago, the espresso, the certainty, the 3 words delivered like a business decision. She thought about 8 months of careful, methodical reconstruction of something old, conducted in the margins of something present. She thought about the 42-page document on Margaret's desk, and the handshake across a cafe table, and Diane Fowler saying, "I prefer honesty to modesty." "We can get further faster." "Thank you," Clara said to Vivian Cole, and she meant it entirely. She pushed open the door to Margaret's inner office, sat down across from her attorney and said, "We need to revise our approach. I'll explain why. And then I want to talk about accelerating the timeline." Because Nathaniel Hargrove had made one critical miscalculation. He had spent 8 months building something behind Clara's back, certain she wouldn't see it coming. He had forgotten that she was, above all else, very good with numbers, and numbers, in the end, always told the truth. The Alderton Funds Committee meeting took place on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue, 6 blocks north of the Hargrove Tower. Clara had walked past Nathaniel's building on her way there, had looked up at its glass face catching the November light, and had felt something she could only describe as gratitude. Not toward him, toward the version of herself that had kept working quietly in that small room off the master suite, on mornings when the city was still dark and the apartment was silent, and she could have been forgiven for believing that her life was already fully defined. She had prepared for this meeting the way she had once prepared for the hardest presentations of her consulting career, methodically, thoroughly, without drama. She knew her numbers the way musicians know their scales, not by thinking but by instinct, by repetition, by genuine understanding of what they meant. She had rehearsed her answers to difficult questions, identified the weaknesses in her projections, and built honest responses to them, and chosen her clothes with the same care she brought to everything. A deep navy blazer over a cream blouse, simple gold earrings, the small pendant necklace her mother had given her when she graduated from college. Nothing that belonged to the life she was leaving. Everything that belonged to herself. There were 5 people on the Alderton Fund Committee. Diane Fowler sat at the head of the table. The others were a retired investment banker named Howard, a woman named Patricia, who ran a small family office in Connecticut, and 2 younger analysts whose questions, Clara suspected, would be the sharpest. She was right. The analysts came at her projections with the specific aggression of people trying to find the ceiling of her knowledge, probing assumptions, pushing on her customer acquisition model, questioning her pricing structure. Clara answered every question clearly and without defensiveness, and when she didn't have a precise answer, she said so and explained her reasoning. By the end of the session, the room had shifted in the quiet way rooms shift when people have made up their minds but haven't said so yet. Diane walked her to the elevator afterward. "We'll deliberate and have a formal response within 5 business days," she said. Then, more quietly, "You did well in there, Clara. You knew your work." "It's my work to know," Clara said simply. She rode the elevator down alone and stood for a moment in the lobby, her bag over her shoulder, the city moving outside the revolving glass doors. She allowed herself 10 seconds of something that was almost joy, careful and contained, and then she put it away and walked out into the November cold. The formal response from the Alderton Fund arrived in 4 days, not 5. $1.2 million, the full amount. The convertible note structure Diane had described, no board seat, a 3-year runway. A letter that ran to 3 pages and contained, in its second paragraph, a sentence Clara read 4 times. "The committee was unanimously impressed by the rigor of your financial modeling and the clarity of your market thesis, and we believe Ms. Bennett represents exactly the profile of founder this fund was established to support." She sat at the desk in the West Village apartment, her apartment now, the keys transferred 2 weeks earlier as part of the interim agreement Margaret had negotiated, and she read that sentence 4 times, and on the 4th time she let herself cry. Not from sadness, from the release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. She called her mother in Vermont. "Mum," she said when the line connected, "I need to tell you some things." She told her everything. The divorce papers, Vivian Cole, Margaret Holloway, the business plan, the Alderton Fund. Her mother, Eleanor Bennett, was 71 years old and had raised Clara alone after Clara's father left when Clara was 9, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Clara finished there was a brief silence, and then Eleanor said, "I always thought that building was too tall. A person needs to be able to feel the ground." Clara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and realized it was the first time she had laughed in weeks. The divorce was finalized on a cold Friday in December, in a courthouse on Worth Street that smelled of radiator heat and old paper. Nathaniel arrived with 2 attorneys. Clara arrived with Margaret. The proceeding was brief and procedurally correct and entirely without drama, which was, Clara had come to understand, exactly how Nathaniel preferred things. Clean, managed, resolved on his terms, except it was not entirely on his terms. Margaret's documentation of Clara's contributions to the Hargrove Foundation had produced, as expected, a significant revision of the settlement conversation. The restructuring Clara had implemented had increased the Foundation's annual distribution by $6 million over 3 years, a quantifiable, documented impact that Nathaniel's own attorneys had been unable to dispute. The revised settlement reflected that. The final number was considerably larger than Nathaniel's original offer, and the Foundation directorship was replaced with something more meaningful. A formal acknowledgement, written into the settlement agreement at Margaret's insistence, of Clara's specific contributions to the Foundation's growth. It would become part of the public record. Nathaniel had agreed to it. He had not looked happy about it. Standing outside the courthouse afterward in the December cold, Clara pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. Margaret stood beside her, tucking documents into her briefcase with efficient movements. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked. "Like someone who just finished a very long run," Clara said. "Tired, but glad I ran it." Margaret allowed herself one of her small, precise smiles. "You should be. You ran it well." She snapped her briefcase shut. "Call me when you're ready to set up the business entity. We'll need to establish the corporate structure before you deploy the Alderton capital." She walked away toward a waiting car, and Clara stood alone on the courthouse steps for a moment. Down the block she could see Nathaniel emerging with his attorneys, his dark coat and the familiar set of his shoulders. He glanced in her direction once, briefly unreadable, and then he was in a car and gone. She stood there until the car disappeared around the corner. She thought about the man she had married, his intelligence, his drive, his particular brand of blindness toward anything that didn't fit inside his field of vision. She thought about what it had cost her to live inside that blindness and what it had, unexpectedly, built in her. The patience, the precision, the absolute certainty about what she was capable of, earned not from praise but from 3 years of doing the work without anyone watching. She didn't hate him. That surprised her a little. But hatred requires a kind of attention she no longer had available. She had other things to build. Bennett Advisory Group opened its doors on the 3rd of February, in a suite of offices on the 8th floor of a building in the Flatiron district. The space was modest and well considered. Clean lines, good light, 2 small meeting rooms with glass walls, a kitchen that always smelled of coffee, a view of Madison Square Park that was not 70 floors above anything. It was on the ground level of the world, or near enough to it, and Clara had chosen it deliberately. She hired 2 junior advisors, a woman named Sophie, 28, sharp and quietly fierce, who had spent 3 years at a private equity firm and left because she was exhausted by the culture, and a man named Marcus, 31, who had grown up in the Bronx and put himself through business school and understood from lived experience what it meant to stand outside a room where capital was being distributed and not speak the language of the people inside it. Clara had interviewed 11 candidates. She had chosen the 2 who were hungry for the right reasons. On the morning of the opening, her mother drove down from Vermont and arrived at 7:30 with 24 muffins from the bakery in their hometown and the particular expression of a woman who had spent 30 years quietly betting on her daughter. They sat together in the empty office before anyone else arrived, drinking coffee and looking out at the park, the bare February trees and the dog walkers, and the first pale light coming over the buildings. "Your father would have had something dismissive to say about all this," Eleanor said. "Probably," Clara agreed. "He would have been wrong. He usually was." They sat with that comfortably, the way people sit with old truths that have long since lost their power to sting. The first client came in February, then 3 more in March. By April, Bennett Advisory Group had 7 active clients and 2 more in conversation, and Diane Fowler had mentioned Clara's name to 2 colleagues in the impact investing community, and Sophie had closed the firm's first deal, a growth capital arrangement for a 43-year-old woman in New Jersey who had been building a catering business for 9 years and could not get a single bank to look at her seriously. When Sophie told Clara about the closing, she was nearly vibrating with the particular energy of someone who has done something that matters. Clara listened and asked the right questions, and when Sophie left her office, Clara sat for a moment in the quiet and thought about that woman in New Jersey, the 9 years, the work that hadn't been seen, the door that had finally opened. She knew something about all 3 of those things. In May, Rachel Hargrove called. Clara and Rachel had not spoken since the divorce, and the call came on a Sunday evening, cautiously. Rachel apologized for the things she hadn't said, for the dinner where she had let Vivian's name slip and then immediately retreated, for the larger silence she had kept while her brother dismantled Clara's marriage. "I should have told you more," Rachel said. "I should have been braver." "You were in a difficult position," Clara said. "That's generous. It's true, though." They talked for an hour, not about Nathaniel mostly, but about Rachel's own life, the gallery she was trying to open in Chelsea, the funding she couldn't find. Clara listened. At the end of the call, she said, "Send me your business plan. I'll look at it this week." There was a pause. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Clara said. "Send it anyway." She hung up and went to the window. The May evening was soft and warm, the city beginning its long, slow exhale toward summer. Below on the street, people moved in the unhurried way of a Sunday, carrying groceries, walking dogs, sitting on stoops. The ordinary texture of a life lived at street level, close enough to the ground to feel it. Clara Bennett had been handed a document designed to diminish her, and she had turned it into a door. She had walked through it, and standing at her own window, in her own office, in the life that was entirely and completely hers, she understood something she wanted to hold on to, that the truest things about a person are almost never visible to the people who underestimate them. They are built in silence, in small rooms, in the early mornings before anyone else is awake. They are built one careful page at a time, and when the moment finally comes, they are ready.